And for those of you who are joining us, we're following Jesus, following him chronologically, and we have gotten to the part in the Sermon on the Mount when he is talking about divorce, marriage, and remarriage. This is the second part of a 4-part series. I think it's 4-part. It may end up even being 5-part, but 4-part series at this moment on divorce and remarriage. And what we're going to cover for today is what Jesus says on divorce and remarriage, his sayings and what he had talked about. So I really encourage you, if you were not able to join us last week, and please go video.aciw.org and watch the background and introduction. Part 1 on this series was background and introduction. And this week are the teachings of Jesus on that. And again, we're going to use Pastor Mike Winger, what he has to say on this. I think around the 12-minute mark of him speaking today, I do want to give a little more detail on a particular verse. And so you'll see me a little bit within what he is saying. But without further ado, let's go to Divorce and Remarriage, Part 2, the teachings of Jesus.
Now let's go verse by verse. Next section is this. We're going to deal with Jesus' teaching on divorce in Mark chapter 10. So here we are, Mark chapter 10, and we'll dig through Jesus' teaching on Mark on divorce. It says, and he left there and went to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and crowds gathered to him again. And again, as was his custom, he taught them. And Pharisees came up, and in order to test him asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Now, this is where I'm going to take the stuff I've done in Deuteronomy and bring it into the understanding of Mark. Why I say they would just assume that there were other reasons Jesus wasn't mentioning to divorce. And that's because the debate of the Jews wasn't whether or not anyone could ever get divorced. The debate was, when was it appropriate to get a divorce? And there was the any matter, get a divorce for any reason you want school, Hillel. And then there was the Shammai school who said only for unchastity. So did the Jews think, was the question here, as it sounds in English to us, is the question really like, is it ever okay to get a divorce? That's not really what they're asking. What they're asking from their perspective, as they would think about this question, is which divorces are okay? Like, when is it okay to get a divorce? And Jesus is going to reject the any matter view, which Matthew supplies in Matthew 19:3 as the context when he says, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? He adds the phrase any cause into the question of the Pharisees. And there's a parallel passage in Matthew. So they're asking Jesus to weigh in on the current debate, to test him and maybe get him in trouble with some crowds because it's a controversial topic. And we also will see, to give you another piece of evidence in the case that they're arguing from the debate between the Hillelites and Shammaites. And I'm not out on a limb on this. Everybody agrees on this, okay? All the people who study it deeply agree that the Hillel and Shammai discussion, that's the backdrop for this question. But to give another clear reason why, they're about to quote from Deuteronomy 24 in verse 4. So Jesus says, what did Moses command you? And they said, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away. So they're quoting from Deuteronomy 24. They're asking him to comment on the Hillel-Shammai discussion. So this gives weight to hearing Jesus' restriction as commenting on this debate. But Jesus' response will not just be to agree with Shammai. Let's look at what he says in verse 5. And Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. So Jesus is like, what did Moses tell you? They go, Deuteronomy 24. And he's like, yeah, you kind of missed the whole Genesis 1 stuff, right? He refers to Genesis 1:27, Genesis 5:2, and Genesis 2:24 to get to the heart of the issue. And the heart of the issue is this. Marriage is God's design. It's a divine design by God about the nature of man, one man, one woman coming together and being married. The two become one flesh, and it's a oneness created by God. Mark 10:9, he says, right there on your screen. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. Now, Paul takes this even to another level when he reveals to us in Ephesians 5 that this is a picture of Christ in the church, that husband and wife is Jesus in the church. So to recklessly think like, can you get a divorce, whenever you want, is to just not fundamentally understand what marriage is. We don't appreciate this enough. We often, in our struggles in marriage, when we go through them, we think, I'm not happy, instead of, what is this marriage? It's about me being happy instead of about preserving this incredible, glorious thing that God has given me, that he has created, and seeing the holiness of it, and seeing how it pictures Christ in the church and how it's part of our very nature. It's hard to see this when we're looking at how someone's acting instead of being reminded of the very nature of marriage. Just the nature of your marriage should inspire a change in your behavior towards your spouse. You're not just dealing with their bad attitude. You're dealing with one who you are one with, and you should honor God in that. So I'm going to offer now 3 principles that we can get so far from what we've done in Mark. Here's the principles, and I'm going to be putting principles on screen as we go here. First principle, marriage is a union that God created, therefore we should keep it together. This is a general rule. Second principle, divorce is wrong and shouldn't be done. I mean, that's from Mark, right? We're just getting the data from Mark. Divorce is wrong and shouldn't be done. Third principle, divorce coupled with remarriage is actually adultery. This is pretty heavy stuff, and it comes right from the next verses we get in Mark. So here we are. Verse 10, and in the house the disciples asked him again about this matter, and he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. So hence we have our third principle, right? Divorce coupled with remarriage is adultery. Now I say principle, I don't mean, as you already know, I don't mean like this is a law that must apply to every scenario and situation, but it is a principle, and we must absorb it as true. We need to allow the weight of this to hit us. These are really big things, these 3 principles that we've gotten so far. Now, there's not much different in this section here than what we have in, say, the Matthew text. It answers the question, though. Here's something to note. Some people think Jesus is only talking about protecting women, right? He only wants to say that women, if a man divorces a woman and gets remarried, it's adultery, but he has no comment on a woman getting divorced or the woman divorcing the man. There are some people who try to point that out, but that doesn't work with the text, because in verse 12, it says, if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. So it applies to both people. It goes both ways. Women divorcing men was rare. That's true back then, but it could be done either if they did the Greek version of divorce, where they just leave, and under Roman law, that's ends the marriage unilaterally. You don't need permission or anything. Or the Jewish version, where a woman could push to try to get her husband, even by the courts, to be forced to writing a certificate. So there was a way to do it. It wasn't the easiest thing in the world. So my conclusion so far is about Mark. There's a rule or principle that marriage is a union from God, and therefore you should stay married. And that is all that most of us need. Most of us don't need any more information than that. I think you should go back to Scripture right now if you're contemplating divorce, and you start by radically following the Lord's commands to you as a husband or as a wife. I have a teaching for husbands and wives in the video description that I think you should check out, whichever one applies to you. That's the starting point. That's the beginning place, right? Value of marriage, honoring that, seeking to follow Christ unilaterally. But we get a principle number 4 that I'll put up. Divorce, and this is a big deal. This is where Jesus disagrees with the Shemaites, right? This is where he's putting his own thing out there. Divorce does not end the moral obligation of the marriage. This is heavy. Now, I think it's a real divorce, and I'll talk more about that later. But as a general rule, it just doesn't end the moral obligation of the marriage. So reconciliation is to be sought even after divorce. Even if you're divorced, you should be seeking to reconcile with your spouse if you want to follow the teaching of Jesus. This, again, is where Jesus goes much further than the Shemaites. And so I don't think he's just siding with them. I think he's providing his own teaching. Divorce doesn't end the moral obligation of the marriage. I think it does end the marriage, but not the moral obligation. That's how I put all that together. More on that later. Okay, let's talk about Luke. Let's move over to the section on Luke. This will be shorter. Jesus is teaching on divorce in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 16. In Luke 16, verse 18, we read Jesus' words in the Gospel of Luke on this topic. And there's very little in Luke. It's just pretty much this one verse. It says, everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. This seems like a clear cut and dry fact of reality. This is not where our culture would agree. Generally speaking, when a woman or man says, I'm getting divorced, everyone rallies around them and they're like, you do what you need to do to keep you healthy and strong, and da-da-da. And very few people are willing to say something like this. Jesus' words would not be welcome in our culture, but they need to be welcome in the hearts of Christians for sure. It's the same principle we talked about earlier, that you get married, you stay married. Divorce and remarriage in general is an adulterous thing. Now, they would likely assume some exceptions. Jesus makes an exception clear and Paul makes another one clear, but the rule is what we need the most. We have to apply the exceptions very carefully and not too broadly. This is, again, I feel especially obligated since I'm teaching you that, and will teach, there's several reasons for divorce that I must remind you that most of them won't apply to most of the people watching this video. We ignore the value and nature of marriage. We become calloused to our calling as husbands and wives. We rack up excuses. We play the victim. We become blind to our issues. We make their issues as big as possible. We blow them out of proportion. We would rather quit the marriage before ever obeying the radical call of Jesus in some cases. And this is what we need to get into our hearts, that divorce coupled with remarriage most of the time is adultery. Big deal. Let's talk about Matthew 5. Jesus is teaching on divorce in Matthew chapter 5. And here we get the first time where Jesus offers a clear, specific exception to the rule about no divorce and remarriage. He says, but I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. And now we're going to get into some of our debates. Does this mean that divorce in and of itself is adultery? Because the way it's written here, right? He who divorces her makes her commit adultery. I think not. You can make a case for this by saying, hey, look, the context says everyone who divorces his wife, ... makes her commit adultery. Therefore, divorce itself is adulterous. But against this would be a few things. The rest of the context shows that Jesus is thinking of remarriage in view, right? Whoever divorces and then whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So there's remarriage is just assumed, and it would be happening in that culture. You get a divorce, you're going to remarry somebody. Everybody gets married. That's kind of what happens. That's how it works. And there's lots of reasons for that. But in their culture, they would all get married. We have way more single people now than they ever had back then. So I think that we should consider this part of a divorce and remarriage coupling. That's the hypothetical. And the result of the pro side, of the side that says that divorce itself is adultery, is that the woman is now guilty of committing adultery, even if she's merely the unwilling victim of a divorce. Think about that. That seems really wacky. So here's another question. Does this mean that divorce doesn't actually work? And now I'll deal with the debate on, is divorce ontologically indissoluble, which means that once you're married, literally nothing can break the marriage. Not even a proper divorce, not even a justified divorce. Like nothing will break this marriage, so that if this person is still alive, for the rest of your life, you're still married to them, no matter what happens next. I think that this is wrong, but I'll offer the case for it. Here's the case for it. The case for the unbreakability of marriage, or the idea that marriage can never end, is one. This is a big deal to some people. Right? The Catholic Church says so. That is probably the strongest thing. If you're a Catholic in particular, then you'd think this is a really big deal. Or another way to put it would be, hey, well, that's what a lot of the church fathers thought. I'll cover the church fathers later. But it does seem that this was a progressive development historically, and a mistranslation may have contributed to this. In Ephesians 5:32, Jerome translates a discussion about marriage. Paul talks about marriage, and it's a profound mystery in Ephesians 5:32. But Jerome translates this as a sacrament, and it's not a mystery, but a sacrament.
All right, I stopped it there so we can go and take a look at this Ephesians 5:32 question. This Ephesians 5:32 question. Now, as Mike mentioned that Jerome in the Catholic Church, St. Jerome, I just say Jerome as a Protestant, is that he wrote the Latin Vulgate. Okay, this was basically, he was commissioned by Pope Damasus I. So let me just read this because I do not know this by heart. So let me just read this on what happened and how this came about. So Pope Damasus I commissioned Jerome to produce one standard Latin text of the Bible. Now, the reason is that there were many different Latin versions of the Bible at the time, and Damasus wanted the church to have a standard version, okay? Standard version to promote a universal doctrine. All right, Jerome started this in the late 4th century, and he completed it, they think, basically at the dawn of the 5th century. I have here AD 400. I think I've also seen AD 402 on that as well. So it depends on what you do, but around in that area was when he was finished. Now, I want to share with you Ephesians 5:32 and share with you the difference and why there is this challenge. So let me put this up on the screen. All right, the mistranslation of Ephesians 5:32. So the Latin Vulgate, and I apologize for my Latin, which I never studied. So Sacramentum hoc magnum est ego autum, I'm saying dico, I guess, in Christo et in Ecclesia. Now that means, as I have written here, this is a great sacrament, but I speak in Christ and in the church. But the challenge is, the New Testament was originally written in Koine Greek, and that's not even the same Greek as today. Koine Greek basically started around in 330-ish BC, around Alexander the Great, around in that time frame, and lasted and was used by Greeks up until about AD 600, approximately. So during the time of Christ, this was the Greek that was used. So in Koine Greek, so it's ta mysterion tu tal mega estin ego de lego eis Christan kai eis tend ecclesian. My Greek's a little bit better than my Latin. And that means, which means this mystery is great, but I speak to Christ and to the church. Now, this is like, whoa, this is a great sacrament. This mystery is great. That is a huge difference. So what is the word that is the challenge? The challenge is where you see that Greek word mysterion, okay? And it's actually pronounced mysterion, actually. Mysterion. Mysterion, and I want you to see this for yourself, that in the Greek at that time, to show you, here's the definitions for that Greek word. Okay, so you can just, for yourself, here are the definitions for mysterion. Number 1, hidden thing, secret, mystery. Generally, mysteries, religious secrets confided only to the initiated and not to the ordinary mortals. A hidden or secret thing, not obvious to the understanding. A hidden purpose or counsel, secret will. A secret will of men, a secret will of God. The secret counsels which govern God in dealing with the righteous, which are hidden from ungodly and wicked men, but plain to the godly. 2, in rabbinic writings, it denotes the mystic or hidden sense of an Old Testament saying, of an image or form seen in a vision, of a dream. That's, if you go back to the Greek of that time, that's what that word means. Now, the scholar Jerome did a great job with the Latin Vulgate, okay? But he did that on his own. And this is one of the challenges sometimes when you have a translation just done by one person. There's no checks and balances. So there ends up, and this is where people go, well, how do you know the Bible's true and all this other stuff? And I'm not going to get into that discussion now. But what we do now as far as our translations, they're way better than they used to be. And for example, we use the ESV where there's many scholars who actually contribute to this and study this and go back. And also we have just, again, back then, we're talking about the late 4th century AD. we are now in the 21st century. So we have actually learned and gotten many more fragments and information of scrolls and different parts of the Bible and repeated parts of the Bible to actually confirm what was written. So I don't know, due to time, I didn't go and say, why did he translate it this way? Because as you can see, it has nothing to do with sacrament, but that's what happened. So I wanted to elaborate on this a little bit more because Mike didn't get into that detail. I believe that is very important that you know this, that this is, again, because this is one of the major points about the Catholic Church on this. And again, I'm not trying to hate on the Catholic Church. I'm to hate on Jerome or whatever. I'm just providing you the facts. You make your own decision. And you can check, as I always say, check me out. Go check out to see if what I am saying is true. So without further ado, we're going to go back to Mike as he continues going through the teachings of Jesus on divorce and remarriage.
And so he starts to change the understanding slowly. It progressed over years to the idea that marriage is this sort of unbreakable thing. It just can't end except by death. And I'm not sure what other reasons there are. It seems to me that most of the reasons for thinking marriage is utterly unbreakable, like even with the divorce, even with a justified divorce, you're still married to the other person. I don't see any good biblical reasons for it. It's all historical analysis. Now, here's some reasons not to think that. Jesus did not say, you cannot, what God has joined together, you cannot separate. He says, what God has joined together, let not man separate. I mean, this implies that man can separate it. Jesus also affirmed in his discussion in John 4 with the woman at the well that she had had 5 husbands. He says, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you have now is not your husband, which means a couple things. For one, the guy she's with now, even though they're sleeping together, they're not married. So sleeping doesn't make marriage. Sex doesn't make marriage. But also that she'd had 5 husbands. He seems to affirm that she had 5 husbands. That he doesn't say you've had 1 husband and 4 adulterous pretend marriages. Also, God divorcing Israel implies that it can really happen. God divorced Israel in the Old Testament, so the implication is that that's like an ontological reality, like this thing can actually happen. In 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul says that the believing spouse is not bound in such cases where the unbeliever wants to leave, this makes a lot more sense if marriage can actually be ended. Otherwise, of course, they're still bound. Doesn't matter if they leave, doesn't matter what happens, it's unbreakable. The exception in Matthew, right where we are now, Matthew 5:32, except on the ground of sexual immorality. Well, the fact that there's an exception means that a justified divorce must actually break the marriage, if nothing else. Then the affirmation in Deuteronomy that we read earlier, Deuteronomy 24, that a woman cannot return to her first husband after remarrying a second husband. But if the second marriage was invalid and the first husband is still her husband, why on earth can't she come back to her husband? It wouldn't make sense. I'm not saying that we're under the law of Deuteronomy. I'm saying that Deuteronomy doesn't make any sense on that theory. Like even in the context of ancient Israel, it makes no sense if marriage can't be broken. So what does it mean? It means then that divorce does actually work. It separates you from your spouse. And I think every divorce works. Every divorce is a real divorce. But this was our what was it? Principle 3? There it is. Principle 4. Divorce doesn't end the moral obligation of the marriage. And that's why I worded it that way. It's not just me. Jay Adams, in his book on this topic, he says the same thing. And I think it's accurate. I think it's a good way to harmonize and understand what's going on here in the different texts. Divorce is real. It actually ends the marriage, but it doesn't end the moral obligation to reunite the marriage because of the nature of what God has done. So I think that gives us a better understanding. Let's talk now about a topic that comes in Matthew 5 and in Matthew 19 about Jesus' exception to the rule. Jesus' specific exception here is except on the ground of sexual immorality. And there's a whole debate amongst scholars and theologians on what did Jesus mean by sexual immorality. Now, the Greek word here is porneia. And that may sound familiar. You may be like, wait a minute, we get our English word pornography from that, porn from that. And that's absolutely true, we do. But the Greek word doesn't mean what the English word means. Don't think that 2,000 years later we have an English word that sounds similar, that they mean the same thing. The question we have to ask here is what on earth did Jesus mean for except on the ground of sexual immorality. What did he mean? And there are five options that are given for what this word means. And I'm going to go through all five of them. First, I'll just overview them. Okay. I'm just going to talk you through all five real quick so you can get a good like survey of the landscape. And then I'm going to go through them one at a time to try to help us understand what the exception is. Because, hey, this is important. Maybe you're thinking, I think I have a legitimate grounds for divorce, but what does Jesus mean by sexual immorality? So one option is thinking that it's only during engagement, that sexual immorality refers to premarital sex, that a couple's engaged, and let's say the guy, he goes out and he sleeps with somebody, the girl goes out and sleeps with somebody before they get married. Then you find out about this, so you cut off the engagement. That's one argument. Another option, number two, is that it's incest, that porneia specifically refers to incest, in which case Jesus isn't really saying, you can get a divorce if you've married a relative. He's just effectively saying like that marriage never should have been anyways. You're kind of annulling the marriage. It's an invalid marriage to start with. So that's some people's view. Porneia means incest. A third view is that sexual immorality or porneia, it refers to specifically adultery in the sense of natural physical intercourse with someone of the opposite sex while you're married to someone else of the opposite sex, right? So I've got, if I cheated on my wife and I actually slept with some woman, God forbid, then that would be considered adultery. Very strict, very like full scope of the term adultery. Fourth view is that it's spiritual adultery or apostasy. There are people who put this view forward. I know it sounds wacky to most of us. So that like if you have like an ungodly partner, then you can divorce them. It's spiritual adultery. And there's, the Old Testament talks about adultery in that sense. And then the fifth one is that porneia, and this is my view, of course, is that porneia is an umbrella view for sexual sin. It's a term that refers to all kinds of sexual sin. It's a very generic term. If it's done in the context of marriage, it's adultery. If it's done in the context of singleness, it's not adulterous, but it's still sexual immorality. So that adultery is one of the things that fits under the term porneia, but it's only one of them. All right, now we're going to go through the debate. Okay, definition one, let's imagine you want to make this case. How would you make the case, and then how would we refute it? So definition one is that porneia, Jesus' exception for divorce, only refers to sexual violation of an engagement, such as sleeping with someone other than the person you're engaged to, and it's mutually exclusive to adultery while in marriage, so that even if your spouse sleeps around, you can't divorce them. That would be this view. Now, how do people make a case for this view? They say, why Matthew has the exception, and we don't see it in Mark and Luke, is because Matthew's trying to give us justification for why Joseph was going to divorce Mary. So in Jewish context, the Jews did require a divorce to stop an engagement. You actually had to get a divorce to stop an engagement. But they would say this is what Matthew's doing. He's saying, look, this is why it was okay for Joseph to divorce Mary, or at least he planned on it, and that was a righteous thing according to the text. And that's okay because it was porneia. She had, in his mind, he thought she had committed sexual immorality. Now, this depends on isolating the meaning of porneia to this, but this is totally unsustainable. I mean, this just utterly falls apart when you actually look at the usage of the term porneia in various texts in the Bible and out of the Bible at the time. It completely fails. Now, the view that this is referring to, premarital sex during engagement, that view is utterly refuted by a number of things in the scripture. Number one, porneia, the term is used in a variety of ways in the Bible. In 1 Corinthians 5:1, it's talking about incest. In Jude, verse 7, it's talking about homosexuality. And I know there's a debate on that, but it is. That's what it's talking about. Porneia is talking about adultery in the Septuagint, or the Greek translation of the Old Testament that many of the gospel authors were familiar with. In Jeremiah 3:2, it talks about adultery and calls it porneia. In Jeremiah 3:6, it talks about adultery and calls it porneia. Also in Ezekiel 16:23, Hosea 2:3, and verse 5, Amos 7:17, it's not referring to premarital fornication. It's referring to adultery in those places. A third reason to reject the engagement view would be that Jesus uses the term in the context of a question about marriage and divorce, not engagement and breaking off engagement with a divorce. It relates to two Old Testament texts that he even is referring to, and they're referring to, that are about divorce after marriage, not anything that happens during an engagement period. And so there's the Old Testament context of the verses that are being quoted. Also, third reason to reject that view, the debate of the day wasn't about engagement, it was about marriage. So not only are the Old Testament texts about marriage and divorce, the debate and the question Jesus weighs in on is about marriage and divorce, not engagement and divorce. And number 4, God divorced Israel for fornication. So this view would say that God did something wrong in Jeremiah 3 when he divorces Israel for fornication. They weren't just betrothed. There was a marriage there in the analogy of Scripture. A 5th and final reason to reject this engagement hypothesis comes from a non-canonical book called Sirach. And it's in chapter 2, verses 22 and 23, where it accuses someone of committing adultery by fornication. Now, the terminology there in the Greek is really interesting because it says committed adultery by porneia, so that porneia is a umbrella sexual sin that causes adultery. Why? Because you were married when you did it. And that's, of course, my view on it, which I'll get to in a minute. So the second definition we'll cover is this. We've ruled out the engagement hypothesis. It's that porneia is just incest. And so it basically means, and this is, by the way, this is the position taken by Roman Catholic scholars. This is the position they're going to defend. It's most common amongst them. And they're going to say that basically, look, if you marry your sister, then the marriage is invalid and they get annulment, an invalid marriage. So that's the only time you can separate from someone you've married, is you find out that you're close relatives. And so then you have to separate, of course. Now, to try to build a case for this, they'll say that Leviticus 18 in the Jewish context, Leviticus 18 in the law, it specifically restricts marriage from happening between relatives. You can't draw near to your father's daughter, your sister, your mother's sister, that kind of thing. It's relatives can't get married together. That's the idea. And they're like, this connects Jesus' exception to a specific Old Testament rule. And that is kind of one of the reasons they build this case. Another one is they say 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1 refers to this as porneia, incest. It's actually reported that there is sexual immorality, porneia, among you, and of a kind that is not tolerated even among the pagans, for a man has his father's wife. So they say, look, porneia is incest. And we'll argue against that in just a minute, but I'll leave it up for you guys to kind of ponder on. Now, in Leviticus 18, against this view, there's several things. Leviticus 18, it never uses the word porneia. And that's the whole point. The whole argument here is that that's what porneia means, not just that that's something you can't do. So ancient and modern audiences would never make this connection. Modern audiences should never make this connection. And this is just ignored by people who hold this view, at least the ones I've read. They point out Leviticus 18, but they don't even acknowledge that the Greek for porneia is never there in the text. So the connection's completely broken. The 1 Corinthians 5 passage, it doesn't say that all porneia or sexual immorality is incest. It rather refers to incest as a kind of porneia, right? Yeah, this sexual immorality among you is of a kind that's not even tolerated among the pagans, for a man has his father's wife. So this is just an umbrella term. It's a kind of sexual immorality. Porneia is also in the text I've shared with you already, but there's more. It's often used of other issues unrelated to incest, not only in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament as well. In the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was around in the first century, they used the word porneia to refer to all sorts of things other than incest. So there's just no real grounding for this view. It's unlikely, actually, that a Jew like Paul or Jesus would even consider an incestuous relationship as a proper marriage, meaning that the divorce certificate wasn't even needed in this case, so much as like a kind of annulment. So none of it fits. It's a very forced theory because the Catholic Church has a particular doctrine of divorce and remarriage, and so they're coming up with theories to support it. The third definition for porneia that I also disagree with is that it just means adultery, no more and no less than full adultery. And the pro for this, the reason to support this view, is that it can mean that. Like, that's a possible meaning for the term porneia. It could mean adultery. Against this view are several things. In the Greek, there is a word for that. There's a word that simply and always means adultery, and that is the word moikeia. Moikeia. And that's not the word Jesus used. He used the word porneia, except for sexual immorality. And when he talked about adultery later, he uses the word moikeia. Matthew already actually, in Matthew 5:15-19, he uses both words together. Why is this significant? Because if porneia just means adultery, then you wouldn't use both words together like this. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, and sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. But if porneia, sexual immorality here, if that means adultery, why does it also say adultery? So they're not just synonyms, or so it seems to me. Then we get to the fourth definition. This one I think is probably the worst one, as far as it just not having any grounding. And that is that you can divorce someone for spiritual adultery or apostasy or backsliding, that kind of thing. And this is not only is there nothing to support this view except for saying, well, adultery is used symbolically in the Old Testament. That's it. It's not that it's used symbolically with Jesus in the Gospels, it's that it's used symbolically somewhere else. But against this view is the idea that Paul actually teaches in 1 Corinthians 7 to remain with an unbeliever and make the marriage work, not to divorce them. So the original audience, they never would have thought this. They never would have thought spiritual adultery was a cause for divorce. So we're left with our fifth definition, which I think is the accurate one, that porneia is an umbrella term for sexual immorality, which could refer to any kind of sin during marriage that is of a sexual nature. It can also refer to those same sins while you're not married. It's an umbrella term, so it can refer to any of those kinds of things. Now, I think that this seems like the correct view. I think it harmonizes all the uses of the word. And most interestingly, the Sirach verse I quoted earlier that says committed adultery by porneia, by fornication. And it also allows us to ask a new question. Why did Jesus say porneia instead of moikuo or moikue? Why did he say, sexual immorality instead of adultery? And I think it's because of this. If he said adultery and not porneia, then it would be difficult to know what to do with bestiality, or if a husband had raped his wife violently. All rape is violent. So if a husband had raped his wife, or someone cheats with homosexual or lesbian encounters outside of their marriage, or does things that are adulterous but less than intercourse, right? They're sexually immoral, but they're not exactly intercourse with somebody else. But by giving us porneia as the excuse instead of adultery, Jesus is opening up bestiality, rape, homosexual encounters, less than intercourse, but truly sexual immoral behavior. It's just a little bit more broad than the term adultery. Now, if you want more on this, which you probably don't, but if you do, D.A. Carson has a commentary on Matthew where he goes through a lot of these in detail, more detail than I've given you. He concludes, and I'll quote him now, "It seems best, then, to permit both porneia and the exception clause to retain their normal force. Jesus is then saying that divorce and remarriage always involves evil, but as Moses permitted it because of the hardness of men's hearts, so also does he, but now on the sole grounds of porneia or sexual sin of any sort. Now, I want to talk briefly before we gather our principles that we've just got from this extensive survey here, debate on Matthew 5. I want to talk about John Piper's view, because John Piper is a very influential pastor, a pastor I love, and I love so much of the stuff he shares. This is done with respect, but I think he's incorrect. Now, I have linked his paper where he talks about his position on the topic of divorce and remarriage. And in that paper, he gives his opinion of Matthew 5:32. So I'll bring it up again, just to make sure we're all on the same page here. In Matthew 5:32, "But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Now, this is taken to mean that she's made to commit adultery only if she hasn't already been doing it. That's John Piper's view. So then it's no exception at all. It's merely an observation. Hey, if you divorce her and she's already been committing sexual immorality, well, then you don't make her commit adultery. Right? And now that's neat. Neat as in it fits. You can take Jesus' statement that way. There's a few problems with this view. One of them is going to be that it doesn't work with Matthew 19. Once you get to Matthew 19 and you see how Jesus says the same kind of thing in a totally different way, you realize that you can't carry this view thoroughly through. And this kind of shows you that that's not what Jesus meant. But I want to quote to you what Craig Keener says about, he doesn't refer to John Piper, but about that view that John Piper holds and the view that others also share. He says, "Some interpretations of the passage argue that this exception is not actually an exception at all. One writer proposes that the clause just means that a woman is not being caused to commit adultery by being remarried in the case of immorality, because she's already committed adultery. The problem with this proposal is that it is simply too ingenious. Were it correct, there would be little reason to state the exception clause to begin with, since it would not add anything to the statement. And if one wished to make such a point, it's peculiar that the point would be stated in such a manner that so few other interpreters throughout history could have caught it." And that's from Craig Keener's book, And Marries Another, which is linked below as well, just as John Piper's article is. So not to mention this, the original audience, in the context of the debate and the question that was asked, would never take Jesus' exception clause to mean, she's not an adulteress. He doesn't make her an adulterer because she's already committed adultery. It just would never be taken this way. And like I said before, you can't take Matthew 19:9 that way, which is why when Piper gets to Matthew 19:9, he never tries to harmonize his understanding of 532 with Matthew 19:9, in my opinion. It just doesn't work together. So Matthew 5:32 is giving us an exception, which now we can say is a principle. Sexual sin can justify a divorce. And because of the way the exception clause is written, which we'll come to later more, sexual sin can justify a remarriage. Now, here's what this does. This makes me want to go back and change our principles that we have had before. I want to change them in accord with Jesus, with the full teaching of Jesus. So principles 2, 3, and 4 can be qualified slightly. Divorce as a general rule is wrong and shouldn't be done. Divorce that is unjustified, coupled with remarriage, is actually adultery. And divorce that is unjustified doesn't end the moral obligation of the marriage. So now we've got that that qualification from Jesus' own lips that, you know, a justified marriage does allow for divorce, does allow for remarriage. The next passage, though, Matthew 19, is of the Gospels the most important one, I think. It's the most extensive passage, and it is Jesus' teaching on divorce in Matthew chapter 19. So here in verse 3, it says, "And the Pharisees came up to him and tested him." I'll put it on your screen as well. Tested him by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? And of course, that phrase, any cause, is a trigger word. We know what that means. It's the Hillelite position that you can divorce for any reason you want. That's the fuller context. Helps us see what the original audience saw. It's a question about divorce for any reason, and Jesus utterly rejects it. And it is, of course, the majority of modern divorces. They fit that bill. The point here is there's strong confirmation already in the Matthew 19 passage that all of Jesus' statements of divorce have the backdrop of the debate on Deuteronomy 24. And it's about the exception of when divorce is okay, not just whether any divorce can ever happen under any conditions. It's really a rejection of any matter divorces or divorces without justification. Verse 4 says, "And he answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." Same thing that we get from the Gospel of Mark. They said to him, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and send her away? And this is great, because this is the question we ask too, right? Well, then wait, if divorce is just generally wrong, why is the law written like that? And verse 80 says, "Because of the hardness of your heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery." So don't get divorced, right? What God has joined together, let not man separate. That's the general rule. That's the overarching concern of Jesus. And that, not the exception, should be our main focus. I should obsess over the nature of marriage, not the reasons for divorce. Although today's study is going to be doing that as well, because at some point you got to talk about it. So the natural question they ask, why did Moses allow it? He says, because you have hard hearts. You were permitted to divorce. It was regulating a bad thing, but it wasn't the ideal. It wasn't giving you, here's your ideal, that you could just divorce because of whatever reasons you come up with. The point is this: the permission of the law of Moses to divorce doesn't imply the rightness of divorce. This takes the whole discussion away from Deuteronomy 24. And this is the second place where I'll say Jesus is not siding with the Shimeites or with hardly anybody of his time. He's not offering sexual immorality as his interpretation, I think, of Deuteronomy 24. Instead, what he's doing is he's saying that he wants to go above their debate. He wants to go to the heart of marriage. He wants to go to Genesis and to understanding the very concept of the oneness of man and woman, and say, hey, don't get a divorce, general rule. And if you do and remarry another, it's generally adultery. He does offer the exceptions, and it's important that we have those, but that's the point. That's where he differs from the Shimeites. Okay, then in verse 9, Jesus says the hotly debated and contested thing here, which is, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. This exception, here's the important thing that we all need to swallow, is the exception not only allows for divorce, it allows for remarriage. And there is a lot of debate and discussion on that topic. What I will say is D.A. Carson's commentary, which I've linked below on Matthew, is helpful here. It evaluates various interpretations, and I think it shows why they fail. Why other options where they go, it's not really an exception for this reason, or the exception applies to divorce but not remarriage, I think that they fail. The short version is this: it fits the Greek well. The Greek, when you combine Matthew 5 and Matthew 19, the two ways Jesus says it differently in both passages, there's really, it's a lot easier to just take the Greek as it is. The exception applies to both the marriage and the divorce and the remarriage, that they're both permitted. Remarriage is permitted in the case of a justified divorce, is the point. This is definitely the majority position among scholars. The exception applies to the divorce and the new marriage. That's the majority position. It also fits the culture. This is what all the Jews would have thought. Any valid divorce allowed for remarriage. So if you were going to say that divorce is valid, then you're going to say the remarriage is also valid. They all would have assumed that unless they were very specifically told otherwise. So I did, like I said, I linked that below if you want more information from D.A. Carson's work. So what's implied in this, though, is that any divorce for an unjustified reason or any other reason is not allowing remarriage. And this is the general rule. And this is, of course, what would disagree with even the Shimeites. Even if they thought you shouldn't have got divorced, they never would have said it's immoral for you to marry someone else now. Like, that's not the way they would have reacted. The disciples, they flip out a bit, and it helps us see how harsh this hits them in their culture. The disciples said to him, "If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry." But he said to them, "Not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given." So they're like, "Look, we shouldn't even get married." And Jesus is like, "If you don't want to get married, don't get married. Go ahead." Then he says, "For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth." I'll put this on the screen for you. There are eunuchs who've been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who've been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who've made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. That's a person who chooses singleness deliberately. We're not talking about castrating themselves. He's talking about just being single. Let the one who's able to receive this receive it. These are like strong words from Jesus. He's showing a few things. For one, in their culture, did you know this, that infertility was grounds for divorce? Even amongst the Shimeites, is that if you were married to someone and after a period of up to 10 years, you still couldn't have kids, they expected you to actually get a divorce and marry someone else so you could procreate, because they viewed this be fruitful and multiply as an obligation for every single human. Jesus is here showing us that the command to be fruitful and multiply, it doesn't apply to every individual in that sense. It's probably applied to humankind in general, and hey, we've done a pretty good job at being fruitful and multiplying. But if having kids isn't such a binding command, because you can voluntarily stay single for the kingdom of heaven, then you can't get divorced for infertility. So that takes off another thing that they would have thought of as an appropriate cause for divorce. So, conclusion here. Give us some conclusions. You can only divorce for sexual sin. That's the general rule and one exception given to it. The nature of marriage is a bond created by God, which man ought not to separate. And if you don't like it, don't get married. That's a real option. You think I don't want to be stuck in a bad marriage I'm not happy with. Well, then don't get married. You're maybe you shouldn't anyways, if that's your situation. Jesus says that's perfectly fine, which gives us principle number 7. Staying single to better serve the Lord is a good option. It's a good option. Now I want to talk about Matthew 19 and how I disagree with some other interpreters on this passage. Again, John Piper, who I mentioned because I respect him and because he influences a lot of people. His position paper, he says, Matthew 19, verses 10 through 12, and I'm quoting Piper now, teaches that special grace is given by God to Christ's disciples to sustain them in singleness when they renounce a marriage according to the law of Christ. Because John Piper teaches that you can't get remarried even after a divorce. Even if they commit adultery, you can't get remarried. You're going to be single the rest of your life. And he takes Matthew's chapter 19, verses 10 through 12 as evidence for this. So, right? Hey, it's better for man not to get married. And Jesus says, well, not everyone can accept it, but only to those to whom it is given. He takes this to mean if you get divorced and have to stay single because you're not allowed to remarry anybody else, then special grace is given to you. But this is again, it's where, in all honesty, I'm just disappointed in the exegetical treatment of the text, like the Bible study tactics or techniques, because this is just being forced to fit with his current view about marriage and divorce. It's clear that this is about staying single all of your life. It's not about getting divorced and then staying single afterwards. This is why, if such is the case, it's better to not marry. The disciples are not complaining about getting divorced and then staying that way. They're worried about being stuck in a bad marriage. That's their concern. So singleness isn't the complaint here. It's the solution to the problem of being stuck in their idea of unhappy marriage. They not only fear a bad marriage, not singleness. They're not scared of just being single. So what loss is there if one can divorce but not remarry compared to singleness? Like this isn't even a risk. Oh, go ahead and get married, and then if they commit adultery, at least you can get divorced, and then you just stay single. Singleness would be the solution. So I think that John Piper's position, this is one of the areas where you see, if you follow him, you see where his exegesis of the passage of those 3 verses it just doesn't fit the text at all. Another scholar, Gordon Wenham, who's very well respected, and he's written a book I've linked below, as well as contributed to another book I linked below, the 3 Views book. He says that one of the reasons why I would be wrong in my understanding that the exception allows for a remarriage in the case of a justified divorce, he would say I'm wrong on that, is because the exception is only found in the Gospel of Matthew. And I'm not kidding. This is like one of his strong arguments against interpreting it that way is, hey, it's only in Matthew. So now Matthew is being made to conflict with Mark and Luke. But when you understand the background debate of the Hillel and Shemaites, these different groups, then it makes a lot more sense to see how they would have naturally understood that it was a rejection of the any matter position of the Hillelite school. It wasn't necessarily a rejection of every possible reason for a divorce. And so once you realize that, you go, okay, hold on. Matthew and Luke aren't contradictory. To the original audience, they would have married perfectly well. Mark, Luke, Matthew, all of them.
It's a lot of stuff. I realize it's a lot of stuff. So we're going to stop there for today. And we're going to pick up next week where we're going to cover, this is part 3, we will cover the teachings on divorce and remarriage in the writings of Paul. Okay, in the Pauline letters, we're going to pick up there. I really encourage you to take the time to go over this again, because there's a lot of material here. And so again, I really encourage you that when we post a video to go to video.aciw.org, take your time and go through it. And I also want to encourage you, this is for you to study, and you may not come out with the same opinion as Pastor Winger does or I do. There are many God-fearing, sincerely seeking the Lord Christians who I consider better theologians than I am and have been seeking the Lord longer, that have a different position than this. I mean, he mentioned John Piper. I would argue to say that there isn't a pastor I listen to more than John Piper. And I say that probably for myself. I don't want to speak for my wife. And if you're on the stream right now, you can put in live, let me know, is I would think that John Piper would be close to her favorite or her favorite as well. So, but on this one, we disagree. Right? And then sometimes, again, trying to understand the heart and the mind of God for us finite human beings, we're not going to get everything right. We're just not. But if you're sincerely seeking the heart of God, God totally will get us to the right spot eventually. And that may not be until we get to the other side of the Jordan. But if you're sincerely seeking after his heart, even the areas where we have these secondary or tertiary disagreements, keep the main things, and the secondary things, the secondary things. So again, I encourage you to study. For those of you where this has touched your heart, where maybe you did not believe in God up to this point, but God's been planting seeds and watering and fertilizing, and something I said is just, for example, it is now sprouted, and it's like, wow, I really believe that Jesus is who he says he is. I believe he is God. I believe that he did come to earth, live a perfect life, died and was buried and rose again, and now is sitting at the right hand of the Father. And he died so I can live. I believe he is who he says. I have sinned against him. There is nothing I can do to make myself right with God. It's only by the blood of Jesus. And I accept his free gift. I repent for my sins. And I commit my life to Jesus for the rest of eternity. Even though I know on this side of the Jordan, on this fallen earth, it's going to be difficult. But there is, I believe what the Bible says, there's that the Holy Spirit will come live in me when I accept Christ. And that power will overcome whatever circumstances and sacrifices and sufferings I will have to experience to serve my Lord and now my King. If that's you today, hallelujah and thank you and welcome to the family. And I encourage you to contact people you know who are already serving the Lord so they can help you, bring you into that local family wherever you are, and help you walk out this walk of sanctification with Christ. If you don't have anyone, please contact us. Either go to the website aciw.org and click contact us, or just send us an email, info@aciw.org. Also, we're on Facebook. Just search A Church in the World. We're only A Church in the World there. Send us something on Facebook message. All of these different opportunities, and we will contact you and put you in touch with a local church that can help move you forward in your walk. And then there's also some of you who may feel that the Lord is calling you to be part of this ministry, and we would love to have you. And so again, either one of those ways to contact us, and we will gladly walk you through the process of joining this local kind of global family. But we have local congregations right now, currently in Painesville and Barnersville, Liberia. And obviously we have our digital family, which is spread out all over the United States and in a couple parts of the world. Well, we love you. Hopefully you have a great rest of your week. And hopefully you can join us next week here at A Church in the World, where we coach people for the glory of God. See you next week.